3 minutes. That's how long Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom sat in the car, parked under a flickering streetlight, unaware that their lives had already ended. 3 minutes before strangers stepped out of the dark. Before guns pressed into ribs. Before the world split open. They had just kissed goodbye. A soft smile. A shared glance. Maybe Chris reached for her hand. Maybe Channon leaned in one last time, unaware that the warmth of that kiss would be the final light she'd ever feel. What came next wasn't a murder. It was an invasion of humanity, surgical and sadistic. It was hours of terror wrapped in laughter. It was a quiet Knoxville house turned into a hell no horror writer could ever dream up. And when the screams finally stopped, there was no music. No prayers. Only bleach. Burnt bone. And bags of silence. This is not just a story of two young lovers. This is a story of what monsters look like when they wear human skin. And how, sometimes, evil doesn't knock. It just opens the door and walks in. Knoxville shimmered beneath a quiet Tennessee sky that night, cold, still, almost too still. On the evening of January 6, 2007, Channon Christian was radiant in the passenger seat of her Toyota 4Runner, her green eyes reflecting the streetlights like pieces of stardust. She and Christopher Newsom, her boyfriend, baseball player, the kind of man mothers dreamed their daughters would marry, had just finished a casual dinner date. They were young, beautiful, and in love. The kind of love that was still new enough to be exciting, but deep enough to be real. They never saw the shadow draw near. As the couple paused near an apartment complex, perhaps to exchange a kiss or laughter, death approached wearing a human face. A carjacking, that's what it would first appear to be. But what began as a theft twisted into something infinitely darker. They were taken forced into Channon's SUV at gunpoint by strangers who hungered not for money, but for domination. The door creaked open at 2316 Chipman Street. Cold air swept in, brushing against peeling linoleum and cigarette smoke thick in the air. Inside, 4 men and 1 woman waited. The house was dark, filthy, a trap cloaked as a shelter. It was not their first crime, but it would be their most depraved. Christopher Newsom was separated first. A blow. A shout. Then dragged through the rotting hallway and into a back room. They tied him up with what they had: shoelaces, belts, maybe a cord. He was stripped, humiliated, raped, and brutalized by multiple assailants. He fought, he must have fought, but there were too many, and they had guns. At some point, he must have realized, they weren't going to let him live. They forced him outside. The air was colder now, the sky a dome of black. The train tracks behind the house were quiet. There, in the dark, Christopher was shot in the back, execution style. But it didn't kill him. He was shot again, this time in the neck and finally, in the head. Still, they set his body on fire. The autopsy would reveal the horror. He had been alive when the flames began to consume him. He died not only in agony, but alone, discarded like trash beside the rails. Channon heard everything. She was in the house, tied up. Maybe she screamed. Maybe she pleaded. Maybe her voice was already gone. But they weren't done with her. What followed defies comprehension. Over the next 30 to 40 hours, Channon Christian endured a cruelty so methodical, so merciless, it left hardened investigators in tears. She was raped repeatedly by multiple attackers, vaginally, orally, and anally. The trauma to her body was so extensive that the medical examiner would later conclude bleach had been poured into her mouth and down her throat in a crude attempt to destroy evidence. Her face was battered. She had bruises on her arms, her torso, her legs. She was forced to sit in her own filth, gagged, bound, blindfolded. Unable to stand, unable to move. The trash bag they eventually stuffed her into may have been in the room with her the entire time. And yet, she survived. 4 hours. Possibly days. They left her there in a waste bin, suffocating slowly in the darkness of that back bedroom. She was naked from the waist down. Her hands and feet were tied so tightly that her circulation had long since stopped. Her head was wrapped in a white plastic bag. Another tied around her body. Another around her feet. All zipped inside 5 large garbage bags. Then shoved into a green kitchen trash can and closed inside a corner of the house. No food. No water. No mercy. While she died by inches, the perpetrators laughed, smoked weed, watched television, scrolled through cell phones that weren't theirs. They rifled through Channon's and Chris's possessions: clothing, ID, wallets, even underwear. Davidson, the ringleader, wore Chris's shoes the next day. The sheer coldness of it all suggested not madness, but a profound absence of empathy. Vanessa Coleman, the sole woman in the house, wrote in her journal during Channon's captivity, "I've had one hell of an interesting year. It's going to be a long, interesting test when I get back. I've learned so much from all of this. It's been one hell of an experience." Experience. That was the word she used. Back at home, Channon's parents were frantic. She hadn't shown up for her best friend's birthday party. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Calls to Chris went unanswered. The police hesitated. She was an adult. Maybe she ran off. Maybe it was nothing. But her father knew better. He hacked into her phone's GPS and traced it to Chipman Street. On January 9th, 3 days after the abduction, officers entered the home with a search warrant. What they found turned their stomachs. In the kitchen, the stench of bleach was overwhelming. In a bedroom closet, the trash can stood silently, unnoticed at first until an officer pried it open. Inside was the broken, lifeless body of Channon Christian. Her skin was gray. Her face frozen. Her body bound and twisted like a broken doll. She had died suffocating in a garbage can, surrounded by the stench of decay and chemicals, only feet away from people who had once smiled at her in passing, in a world that once made sense. The case was no longer a disappearance. It was a descent into the worst corners of humanity. The arrests came swiftly. Lemaricus Davidson, the ringleader, and his half-brother Letelvis Cobbins. George Thomas, soft-spoken but complicit. Vanessa Coleman, who claimed to be a bystander, though her diary suggested otherwise. And Eric Boyd, the last to be caught, the most elusive. Their trials would drag on for years, justice delayed, yet never forgotten. The courtroom held not just evidence, but ghosts. Parents sat clutching photographs of laughing children. Prosecutors choked on descriptions too vile to repeat. Defense lawyers spoke of troubled upbringings, systemic failures. But none of it erased the terror these 2 young lovers had faced. In Knoxville, something broke. The community grieved but also questioned. Was this hate? Was this a failure of humanity? The case drew media attention, but also controversy. Misinformation spread like wildfire. Activists argued over coverage bias. Families of the victims simply wanted one thing: for the world to remember Channon and Chris not for how they died, but for how they lived. Smiles in yearbook photos. Hands clasped at concerts. Hope in their eyes. They were not statistics. They were not footnotes in a dark chapter. They were a daughter and a son. A sister and a brother. A young man who opened doors for strangers. A young woman who dreamed of becoming a teacher. Years have passed. The house on Chipman Street was razed, the earth beneath it cleansed with fire and prayer. But memory lingers. Every January, candles flicker in Knoxville. Flowers are laid. Names are spoken aloud. Channon Christian. Christopher Newsom. Not forgotten. Not ever.